You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
Nice to see everybody. Good morning. We are continuing through a little letter in the back of the New Testament written by a man named James. And we're a few sermons in, so let me catch you up if you're new. What James is talking about in this book is living faith, the kind of faith that's actually alive and kind of makes a difference and asserts itself in your life. One of the problems that we have today when we think about Christianity or talk about Christianity is that so many different kind of interest groups have tried to fit Christianity into their agenda, whether that's like a political agenda or a personal agenda or even like a national agenda. There's all these different agendas that have kind of adopted Christianity and tried to remix it to fit kind of their ideas. Such that now, when someone talks to you about Christians or Christianity, you really have to ask a lot of follow-up questions to know what in the world they mean. Like, are you talking about, like, the Republican version of Christian or the Democrat version of Christian? Or, I don't know, there's a libertarian version, there probably is. Is it the American version of Christian? Is it the suburban version, the city version, the self-esteem version, the radical version? Like, which version are you talking about? And it can take you several minutes to figure out exactly what someone's trying to talk about using the word Christian. And it leaves you wondering, like, what does the genuine article actually look like? Like, what does it look like to say the word Christian and not have an adjective or an ideology kind of surround it and make it its own? And that's what James is trying to get at. James is saying that living faith is sort of like a tree that's planted by a concrete sidewalk in Los Angeles, where originally the concrete looks immovable and extremely solid, and this tiny little sapling looks like nothing at all. But give it a few years, and those roots, come through, crash through the concrete, leave these giant gaping, holes in the concrete where a little dog can fall in, and all of a sudden you realize that living faith is like that. The tree was stronger than the concrete. That living faith overturns other loyalties, other agendas, other interests. Living faith always asserts itself as the most dominant thing. It refuses to be subdued by an adjective. It's its own thing. You can't contain it. And one of the places we see that, the sort of the power of living faith, is in the midst of trials and suffering. And that's what James has been talking about the last several paragraphs. He's saying living faith gives you a new kind of perspective, the way Scott put it, sort of a new set of glasses through which you see reality. It brings reality into focus for you, such that when you're going through trials, you see reality clearly enough to be able to both grieve and have joy simultaneously. These things can coexist without one pushing the other out. That you can not only be on your own for that, but that you can ask God for that wisdom, for those glasses. And it says he'll answer those prayers. He'll be with you like a good father who wants to give his children the things they need to grow and to thrive. Now, we need to keep all of that in mind because this morning, James applies all of this to one of the most dominant factors in our lives, the source of a lot of our trials and a lot of our comfort, and that's the area of money and power and social standing. That's what he wants to talk about. And so let's hear what he says. James chapter 1, verses 9 through 12. It's on page 1011 of your pew Bibles, those red books in front of you. Also on the screen behind me. Here's what he says. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower falls and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. This is the word of the Lord. Now, James he's talking about the low and the rich. He's talking about those who have very little money, very little power, very little social standing, and those who have a decent amount of money, a decent amount of power, a decent amount of social standing. And back in James' day, those were just two giant classes, and there was no middle ground. So everyone found themselves squarely in one or the other for the entirety of their lives. So you were either born lowly, lived lowly, and died lowly, or you were born rich, lived rich, and died rich. And today, most of us do spend most of our lives, if not all of our lives, in one of those categories or the other. And yet, there's more mobility today. So someone can be born in one category and then a few decades later exist in another. And some people can move back and forth based on different seasons and different circumstances. And in a lot of ways, that mobility is a really amazing thing. It's far better in a lot of ways than the way things were before, where there was no mobility at all. You were sort of locked in to wherever you were born. But it has this side effect that James sort of points out that you want to be aware of. Because of that idea of mobility, we often think that our problems in life would be solved just by moving from one of these categories to the other. Because of the idea that we can change our circumstances, we're always trying essentially to move away from lowliness and towards richness. That's kind of the posture we tend to have. Away from low social standing towards high social standing. Away from less control over your life towards more control over your life. If you're lowly, in other words, a lot of the time you spend is time trying to not be lowly anymore. You don't like it. You think about how bad it is to be lowly, how great it would be to be rich. And when you're rich, you tend to spend your time trying to stay rich. Think about how good it is to be rich, how bad it would be to be not rich, and you do your best to hold on to what you have. Now, James is, and neither is the Bible, none of this is against a change in status. It's not against that mobility, but it does point out that side effect for us. James is after bigger game than just figuring out how to help you change status. He says, this arena of money and power and social standing, this is the place where living faith gives you a kind of wisdom to see through those categories and see something larger at work that changes your mindset and changes your approach and adds joy to your life wherever you are. That's what James is after. And in other words, imagine a life where lowliness just points you to a greater joy, where changing your circumstances doesn't actually increase your joy. Or imagine a world where, you look at having the comfortable things you have, the riches that you tend to have in your life, and you're able to say, these things don't own me. I'm not afraid of losing them. They can't touch my joy. This is what James is after for us. Now, how do you get to that place? Well, James teaches us. He says we need to learn about boasting, we need to learn about true riches, and we need to learn about things that fade away. And that's what we'll talk about, boasting, true riches, and things that fade away. So first, boasting. He says in verse 9, let the lowly brother boast. And then it's implied, and the rich person boast. Everyone's boasting. Lowly people are boasting, rich people are boasting. We're all supposed to be boasting. And that's kind of confusing for us because we tend to equate boasting with bragging. That boasting is this thing, you walk around and say, hey, look how great this is. I'm boasting in this thing. I'm bragging to somebody else. And not many of us, I would like to think, consider ourselves as braggers. Like this thing, that's me. I'm always bragging about the stuff I have. No, James assumes that there's kind of a deeper version of boasting. It includes bragging, but it's deeper than that as well. And he assumes that's a factor in your life. That even if you don't have much to boast about, boasting is still on your mind. And we have to understand that if we want to understand the riches that James has for us here. No pun intended. To boast for James is to take pride in, to focus on. What we boast in are the things in our life that are worth noticing and talking about. There are certain things that we sort of foreground in our life, in our identity, and in what we think sort of makes us add value and makes us worthwhile in the eyes of others, how we sort of rank in the larger world in which we live. These are the things we tend to boast in. So it can easily be a kind of internal boasting, not just bragging, where it's a way of thinking about what's of most significance, what's most glorious in your life, which actually the word could also be translated, what you glory in. So what you find beautiful or enjoyable or valuable, where you look for security or peace of mind or hope for the future. And so this is the idea of boasting, and a big part of that, what James gets that we don't always get, a big part of this is the world we live in every day. That we live in a world that has, you live in a world every day, that has a certain set of values. It has a value system that sets some things as higher than other things. Some things are more valuable, are of greater esteem than other things. And it's very tempting. It's impossible not to be tempted to use that metric as kind of the way you understand what you should boast in, what you should glory in, what makes your life valuable, and what makes you sort of good in the eyes of others. There's a kind of stream, in other words, that we're all living in. And it has a pretty strong current that if you don't do anything, it's just going to carry you along towards a certain set of values. So in the world you live in, and I encourage you to think about it now, like where you go during the week, whatever that looks like, there's always an inside and an outside. There's always a high and a low. And you're constantly being asked to play by a certain set of rules as to who is higher and who's lower on the ladder, and to place yourself in that ladder and strive to go up and not down. It's a game of who gets to boast the most. And it's really, really hard to resist. So for example, Erin Callan was the CFO of Lehman Brothers, right up until the Great Recession in 2008. And she wrote in the New York Times, like a decade later, about how she found herself swept along in the way people around her valued work. And she didn't realize it until much later. She says, I didn't start out with the goal of devoting all of myself to my job. It crept in over time. Each year that went by, slight modifications became the new normal. First, I spent a half hour on Sunday organizing my email, to-do list, and calendar to make Monday morning easier. Then I was working a few hours on Sunday, and then all day. My boundaries slipped away until work was all that was left. Inevitably, when I left my job, it devastated me. I couldn't just rally and move on. I didn't know how to value who I was versus what I did. What I did was who I was. Now what's she saying? She's saying, I didn't mean to start working 100 hours a week, but slowly that value system became my own. The one around me just sort of became my own, to where what I boasted in, what I found glorious about my life, was what everyone else said was glorious, which is this amount of time that I worked, the amount of work you put in. Or Sam Polk. He's a derivatives trader, a credit derivatives trader. He runs a lot of nonprofits now, but he came from a very low economic bracket before he was a derivatives trader. And he made, when he became a trader, he got a $40,000 bonus one year. And it blew his mind. He writes about it. He's like, I didn't know what to do. He's like, I didn't know how to hold the check. Like, it was the first time in my life I never had to check my balance before withdrawing money from my bank account. It was just, and he said, it was only a few years before I got a $1.5 million bonus, and I was angry for 2 weeks. He said the problem was, in my company, they sat all the traders, from the interns to the mid-level people, all the way up to the senior executives. We all sat in the same bullpen, and they mixed us up together. And he said, basically, everyone knew the rules. Like, your value was directly tied to making more money than the guy next to you. And he said it became all-consuming. I didn't start with that value system, but that's where I ended up, is what he's saying. It was made clear to both of them in that world, the people who were valued worked long hours. The people who were valued made lots of money. And there's lots of versions of this. But that was the takeaway. I only had worth. I only added value. I was only valuable to society. People only looked at me a certain way if I worked these hours. That's what I had to show for my life. Or for Sam Polk, he kept talking about how people treated me differently. I had respect in the eyes of people that I had never had before. It was amazing how different it was to be treated with respect from everybody. He said, I all of a sudden realized I was higher up on the ladder. Now what's happening? They're being carried downstream. The current got a hold of them. They weren't like trying to do it. They didn't come in being all like brooding and do it. No, it just happened to them because you swim in that water, and if you don't fight it, the current takes you down to use that same value system. And we're in the current too. You are also in this current. You begin naturally to evaluate your life, to evaluate your standing in the world based on that system around you. And you boast externally, internally, or both on the basis of those metrics, of those standards. So are you doing well or poorly? What would bring you up a rung? What do you lack that keeps you down a rung? What do you foreground in your thoughts about yourself and who you are? What do you foreground in your conversations with others about what you do or what makes you valuable? What do you foreground in your own mind and heart during your most insecure moments? Like, what makes you go, oh, this makes me okay? And James puts this in the context of suffering, at least in part, because suffering always reveals what you boast in that you didn't realize you did. Almost always. You might not know what you boast in until it's removed from your life, and you go, oh, it turns out I was. It was running under the surface all along. And you'd say, I don't boast in things. That's not the kind of person I am, until it's gone. I don't care what kind of restaurant I can go to. I don't care what kind of people I can fit in with or how accepted I am in different circles. I don't care what kind of job title I have or how my salary stacks up. But all of a sudden, you lose that job. People don't look at you the same way in those social circles. You drop down a socioeconomic bracket or your circumstances change or whatever, And you realize, wow, I was boasting in these things. This hurts more than it should to have this removed. I feel like I have less value than I ought to feel just for this thing to be gone from my life. And so it helps to look ahead. It helps to understand boasting. What do you boast in? What do you wish you could boast in? What rungs of the ladder kind of work for you in your life right now? Boasting is a bigger part of your life than you realize. We are always evaluating ourselves for what we can boast in. We're always dealing with that current. So that's first. You have to understand that if you want to get to what James is going for here. But second, he wants to talk to you about true riches. Now, the problem with being lowly, that's verse 9, let the lowly brother boast. Now, it's supposed to be counterintuitive, because the problem with being lowly, by definition, is that you don't have stuff to boast in. So it's supposed to be a little bit shocking for you to hear this from James. Lowliness is essentially a life of constantly facing constraint. You're always constrained in your resources, you're constrained in your options, you're constrained in the power you have to change things about your life. Everywhere you look, you bump into lack and constraint. That's lowliness. And James says, you people who are totally constrained, you should boast in that giant high position, in that lack of constraint you have. It's very counterintuitive. The lowly, he says, should boast in their exaltation, which you could just call high position. It's translated that sometimes. And then he tells the rich people that they're actually in a low position. That's what humiliation means. And he explains all of this. The key to all of this is in verse 12. He says, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. Now, what James is doing here is he's saying, he's spent a lot of time talking about current circumstances. And in verse 12, it's a hinge verse sort of between this sermon and the next sermon. He's pointing us past our current circumstances to something that comes after those. He's saying that your future changes your present, and it changes it drastically. Now, we tend to focus on how our present changes our future, on how what we choose now, our choices in the present, affect what comes next. But James is pointing out, we rarely think about how our future changes our present, how what comes next affects our present now. And yet, it's a massive truth. The things that come next always affect your present in drastic ways. So, for example, there's a guy named Eugene Land. He's a millionaire. I want to say this is 30 years ago. He was in East Harlem. And at that time, the school system was really, really rough. It was very difficult. And there was a massively high dropout rate, upwards of 50%, maybe a lot higher than that. There's a lot of crime, a lot of drugs, a lot of incarceration, even at a high school. It was a very difficult place to go to school. And a lot of kids there didn't have a lot of hope that their lives would be any different. And so he got asked to speak to some sixth graders. And he kind of went in like, well, what in the world am I going to tell them? What am I going to say? And in sort of a rash move on his part, he said, look, graduate high school and I will cover all of your college tuition and your books. Which is a pretty great deal. But what's fascinating is, so nothing else changed for these kids. Same school, same middle school, same high school, same people around them, same city, same teachers, everything's the same. Over 90% of them graduated and took them up on the offer. The only thing that changed was their future. And it radically changed the decisions they made in the present. The future changed the present. Or here's another example. There's a program in children's hospitals where what they do is they have teachers or substitute teachers. They kind of come in to kids who have a long stay in the hospital so they can keep up with their schoolwork. So they'll teach them things, or they'll sort of help them do their homework, this kind of thing. So this one young woman, she was a substitute teacher, and she was asked to come for this program. She came in, and she was going to help this boy with nouns and adverbs. So simple stuff. He's probably, I want to say, 4th grade, 5th grade. And she got in, and no one had really told her that his situation was that he had severe burns, like all over his body. And it really shocked her, because it's a visually kind of shocking thing. And so she felt awful, because I came in, I was so shocked by his suffering and his appearance, and I feel like I did such a horrible job, and I kind of stammered through the lesson, and she went home and just couldn't sleep. She felt horrible. So the next day, she gets asked back, she comes back, and the nurse for this boy says, "What did you do?" And she said, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I was so flustered. I felt horrible about it." And the nurse said, No. Like he's responding to his medication. He wants to do physical therapy. Like his body is healing like it's happening. Like, what did you do? And so she's like, "I have no idea. I thought I did horribly." And so they go in and they ask him, like, "Hey, like, anything change like yesterday? And he said, he's young, so I think that it's a paraphrase, but he basically said, well, I thought I was dying. And then they sent this woman in, and I thought, well, they wouldn't want to teach a dying boy nouns and adverbs. And at some point, the hope got into his body. Your future affects your present. The things you hope in affect the way you live. And you experience this every day too. Look, when you know that you have a day, you have an average day, let's say you work a 9-to-5 job, and you're at that job, and it's a grind sometimes, and you have people that annoy you and interrupt you, and there's difficult situations, there's office politics, there's all this stuff, and it's going to be a particularly hard day, and you know that. But at the end of that day, you know that you're going to get to do your favorite thing. A movie, a meal with friends, a good book, a cup of tea, I don't know, something that relaxes you, and there's lots of things. You're going to get to do your favorite thing. That's going to change the way you work that day. You know this is true. When there's something you've been looking forward to for a month, and it's that day, that day at work just gets easier. You're willing to put up with a bit more. You're more upbeat. Your fuse is longer. You can kind of take more of a beating, because you kind of have this thing that you know is coming. But when you know that after your day, that day, comes something you really don't want to do, a conversation you don't want to have, a meeting that is just super someone that's just really draining on you, these sorts of things, something you have to go to some event that's like pulling teeth. What happens during that day? Your future, all of a sudden, now you have a much shorter fuse. You're angry. You can put up with a lot less. You're angrier. Your future affects your present. Now, if your hope for the future colors an individual day with that kind of power, how much more should your hope for your ultimate future cover all of your individual days, color everything that comes your way? That's what James is saying. He's saying, look, this hope, this crown of life, it's not that the blessed person, the happy person is removed from their sufferings now, taken from lowliness to richness just right away, don't pass go. No, it's the hope. After the steadfastness, after all of this, there's this hope that ought to color the way you evaluate these things right now. It should change the way you live in the present day. This hope should make you boast in the right kinds of things in such a way that your life looks different. And what is that future? What is that boasting? He calls it the crown of life. The idea of a crown was sort of after a long race, you get a crown. Not like a king's crown. It's like the victor's crown kind of a thing. You win the marathon, you get this crown. And the crown is life, is eternal life. In other words, the crown of life that James is talking about is the inheritance, the eternal riches that you have in Jesus Christ. James is always talking about his brother. He hasn't stopped now. And so maybe the best way to think about it is the way Paul puts it in 2 Corinthians 8. Verse 9, he says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, by his poverty, might become rich." What James is saying is there's a larger, eternal kind of richness. There are true riches that you have in Jesus Christ that completely renovate how you think about your situation right now. And so you have this little verse of Paul where it's very simple, but it's very profound, where Jesus is described as being rich, and yet on a level that we don't really have the ability to grasp. This is the Bible talks about him being filled with the very fullness of God, with the sense that this is a mode of being with such glory and such adoration and such sort of transcendent beauty that we can't quite get our heads or our hearts fully around it. It is so far removed from the ups and downs that we experience, from the highest of highs and the lowest of lows we have. This is just on a whole other order. The richness, the glory of the ground of all being, the transcendent God, the Creator who speaks with words and creates all things. I mean, we're talking about a whole different thing here. That's the level of richness. And it says that though he was rich, he became poor, which means that simply by coming to earth, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, left more riches than we will ever be able to experience. He left more security than we can kind of grasp or wrap our heads around. We leave security sometimes. We find security financially or in terms of power or other relational security. We left some of that behind. We don't have that anymore. There is no way to compare what we've experienced with the level of drop that Jesus does, just by becoming incarnate, which is sort of a theological term for adding a human nature, for becoming human, just doing that would feel like abject poverty compared to where he was. If this is God taking on flesh, it's a massive impoverishment. And aside from that, then you watch his life, and what happens? Well, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He's stricken, smitten, and afflicted. He's spoken of as being despised, ashamed, and rejected. A man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. In other words, the entirety of his human life was lived as someone who was reckoned as of no value in the standings of that world. I think we tend to like the idea that if Jesus were to show up to us, and we saw him as people back then saw him, we would immediately say, yes, you are the highest of the high. I think we are absolutely wrong. Almost everybody that saw him back then, and even those that didn't were only a few percentage points off, they saw him and they said, this is someone who's of no value. This is not someone important in the world. This is not someone who has importance. I don't need to hang out with this guy. Only a very few people saw past that, and even them, it was very difficult for them. Even the disciples got this wrong most of the time. And in that poverty, where does he go? Ultimately, this takes him to the cross. Philippians, which is, we don't have time to go into all of this, but this is the most shameful of shameful deaths. This is the way you don't want to die. This is the way that your parents don't want to hear that you died. This is the way that you don't want to talk about how someone died because it's a shameful thing and it's embarrassing and it's no one of value dies this way. And that's what Philippians 2 says. He didn't consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but humbled himself, taking the form of a servant, and being found in human form, he humbled himself to the point of death, even death on a cross. That's why the even is there. Death is bad enough for an eternal God, but even a cross. And why does he do all of this? Is that we might become rich. Now, there's something here that has a depth and a breadth that, I don't know, I'm a preacher, right? I teach things. And at some point, you get stopped short. I don't know what to tell you about this. He's essentially saying that there's a trading of places. There's a swapping of values and of destinies and of honor and glory. There's a way that he takes on the poverty that we have, and we take on the richness that he has. At some point, we don't really understand how impoverished we are. We don't realize, we tend to play the human game of add value, take away value so much that we don't have any larger perspective by which to understand how little value we really do have as human beings. On the one hand, God looks down and says, this is the apex of my creation. There's a built-in image of God glory to human beings. At the same time, the sin, the selfishness, the self-centeredness, the bent in on self of us, of all of us, no matter who we are or how great we look on the outside, the way everything turns back around to be about me. There's such a travesty to that, such like a cosmic, treasonous travesty to that, that we don't realize. It's so big we don't realize how big it is. We've distanced ourselves in that from the source of richness in the universe, from the source of value, from God himself. And so from the perspective of heaven, like apart from our petty little squabbling about who's important and who's not, from the perspective of heaven, from a more transcendent perspective, geez, even from a century perspective and not a decade perspective, it's so clear how we're in complete poverty. These games make no difference. And so why, for people like me, for people like us, why does he do this? Like, what's the point of this? And it says, for our sake, yet for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty we might become rich. In other words, his impoverishment is the means that you get true riches. That's the language of the New Testament. Christ takes on the full consequences of our sin and becomes not just impoverished and doesn't have a place to sleep, and not just impoverished in that he suffers a tough death, but impoverished in the fact that built into that death is the experience of an untold number of infinite judgments for me, for you, for us. And in doing that, he removes that judgment and provides the way for forgiveness and an adoption into the family of God such that there's like an inheritance, there's a total access, there's full access to the riches he has as God in the flesh. We become in Christ given an inheritance that is imperishable and undefiled and unfading, kept in heaven for us, who by God's power are being guarded through faith until it's revealed. What do you say to that stuff? You know, there aren't songs strong enough for that. And in that way, do you see what happened though? In that way, that crown of life, that thing that is unshakable, because if you didn't earn it, you can't lose it, and if Christ got it for you at this price, no one can buy it out from under you. That's true riches. Like you take a step back, you realize how petty all this is, and then you look over and you realize this is something different. Those are the true riches that those who are in Christ have. And James says, if that's you, that future is going to change your present. You think about your small future, about how the bank account's going to be, or how the social relationships are going to be and the social standings, or what people are going to say about this, or how people at the office are going to react. And he says, there's nothing wrong with thinking about that. Those are real things, and they matter, and they're important, and they're important to you. But don't get it twisted. Like this is much, much bigger, the true riches you have in Christ, than any of those things that occupy your mind. You have to understand the true riches because your future changes your present far more than your present changes your future at this scale. And that's why he also spends a lot of time, that's 2, on 3, things that fade. If you understand boasting, then you see true riches. It changes the boasting. And he spends a lot of time talking on the fading of riches that aren't eternal, on things that aren't the crown of life and how they fade, because that's where we get caught up, whether we're lowly or we're rich. If you're lowly, you tend to focus on getting the money, the power, the status you wish you had. If you're rich, you tend to focus on keeping the money, the power, the status you have now. Whether you think about it consciously or not, a lot of your energy is devoted to these sorts of things. You try to get stuff to boast in or keep the stuff you already boast in. That's just kind of a default posture. And James points out, if you step back from all of that flurry, where does all that stuff actually lead? And he says, the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, its flower falls and its beauty perishes, so also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. He's using a really common image in the ancient Near East, which were these seasonal flowers. And they were really beautiful, but everyone knew, just by living on earth, that each one of these has an expiration date that is unchangeable. It is immovable. They will expire at a certain point in time. There's literally no way to prolong the beauty of that flower. It's beautiful while it's there, and then it will be gone. There's nothing you can do about it. And he's trying to say, you see, when you hitch yourself, your identity and your boasting, when you hitch your life to money, power, comfort, social standing, to this value system we tend to have in the world, when you hitch yourself to that, it's a big problem because you will fade when those things fade. You see what he says. He doesn't say, well, the riches will fade away. He says, so will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. While he's going about his business, there's a fading, there he's gone. Turns out that was the expiration date. That all these things sort of fade, and your life kind of goes with it. There's this thing you see every once in a while where someone decides to do like a DIY hot air balloon ride, and they do it by going to the store and buying a lot of helium balloons. And attaching them in certain ways to like a lawn chair. Now here's the thing, the science on this totally pencils. Like you can definitely do this. There's an equation, a certain amount of grams of weight for a certain amount of helium, and it totally works. The problem though, is that you have to know a bit more science than that, because helium can permeate through a balloon. Which means that the minute you fill up a helium balloon, it begins to leak. You just can't see it. And so what happens is, if you get enough balloons, you can get up pretty high. But the minute you get up there, you're already leaking. And unfortunately, because they're all leaking at the same time, it's not this steady decline. There's a pretty severe drop-off at a certain point, where all of a sudden, you didn't expect it, all of a sudden, they're looking smaller, and then, oh no, apparently they really are. There's leaking and you're hitting the ground. By hitching yourself to helium balloons, you're basically saying, everything about me, my whole person, rises or falls on these helium balloons. And by doing it that way, the minute they lose altitude, so do you. And that's exactly what Aaron Callan and Sam Polk and some people in here and many people you know have experienced. Where you're able to say, wow, like Sam Polk talks about, I saw people who, in a sense, their helium was leaking, and they were traumatized. And I knew, this can't be my life. I can't hitch my whole life to this. Your whole self fades away. When you build your life on something and it gives way underneath you, your whole life goes. And ultimately, James is saying, one day, your whole life really does go. And all of this goes with it. And so from this perspective, this is a fascinating thing, and it's worth holding on to. From James' perspective, earthly riches aren't just things you should avoid boasting in. They're actually like a temptation. They're a kind of trial in themselves. From this perspective, the worst thing that can happen to you as a human being is nothing bad happening to you. It's one of the worst things that can happen to you is to have nothing go wrong. Because it distracts you. It makes you think the helium is going to stick around. If nothing goes wrong, then, they're never going to deflate. If nothing goes wrong, you're never notified as to what you've hitched your life to. And so you see the temptation for the rich is to do this without realizing it. And the temptation for the lowly is to look for this without realizing that it's all going to go. And in that sense, so what do you do? What does James say you do? How do you handle fading riches, things that fade? He says, for the lowly, you have to boast in your exaltation. In other words, when you're lowly, when you face constraint, he says, you have to reorient your focus on the thing you have that is entirely unconstrained. And that is the inheritance you have in Jesus Christ. It is literally infinite. You have zero constraint coming for you. You have to focus yourself on your future. When you're squeezed, let it squeeze yourself towards the future that you have. Such that, there's ways that everything is sort of compared to a ladder. There's sort of rung, everyone's got a certain rung on the ladder, and you go to different rooms, and there's different ascertaining of what rung you're on, and how you get up, and how you get down, and all these sorts of things. When you get told by yourself or by someone else, directly or indirectly, that you have slipped a rung, that you need to climb more, or that you're falling lower, based on whatever weird value system they happen to be using, what you have to do in that moment, if you're listening to James and understanding reality, is say, no, you don't understand. I've been dragged to the top of the ladder. I can't slip a rung. I didn't climb up myself. He came down and dragged me up. Where am I going to go? And in that sense, if you have a chance to change your circumstances, go for it. It has nothing to do with your ultimate joy, nothing to do with your ultimate satisfaction, nothing to do with how you really are ultimately valued in the universe. Who you are is tied up in something a lot bigger than the rungs that people try and assign you to. And when you experience lowliness, remember your exaltation. Remember your high position in Jesus Christ. And he also says, when you experience richness, and let's be honest, there are plenty of people here. We don't use the word rich, but we are definitely rich. We have a decent amount of money, relatively. We have a decent amount of maneuverability, relatively. The beauty of church is that we have the lowly and the rich and everywhere in between, all in one place, and we all love each other based on something larger than our status. At the same time, I think we can all understand that there's a lot of ways that all of us have a richness that other people in the world don't. When you experience that comfort, when you experience that richness, what do? He says you have to boast in your humiliation. You have to realize how this position is actually small and tiny and a pittance compared to what's coming. In other words, when you get into a nice car, and by nice car I mean one that works and that you can make the payments on and can get you somewhere and without breaking down. When you get into that car, one of the things in the back of your head, your perspective has to be, eventually this will fall apart and not work and rust, and eventually I will fall apart and not work and rust with it. That has to be at least a part of your perception of the world, because that's reality. When you go to a nice job, when you see your title on the door, if that's your situation, you have to look at it and go, well, someday someone else is going to have this. Someday this isn't going to be me. Any host of things could change in a heartbeat, and I wouldn't be here. And in that sense, where is my exaltation? Where does it really lie? My exaltation isn't in these things. These things are humiliation. These things are a low position. James talks about that idea of grass and flowers of the field. He's appealing to Isaiah chapter 40, to a verse that many people reading this would absolutely know. It says, all men are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall, because the breath of the Lord blows on them. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God stands forever. The idea is, when everything else perishes, and all you have left is just you, and you find you're lowly, Take away the maneuverability, take away the social standing, take away whatever. When all that's gone, like grass, you realize I'm just as lowly as anyone else. What's left? The word of the Lord, which in that part of Isaiah is essentially equal to the gospel, to what God intends to do for his people on his own merits for their sake. And so in that sense, when you experience comfort, when you look around and you realize, which you really should do very often, there's a lot of things I have. Even if I struggle in certain ways, there are many things that I have. There are many ways that I belong in the category of the rich. When you look at those things, in that moment, you lean into your lowliness. You boast in your humiliation because none of the trappings of riches or comfort or power actually make you any different. There's a movement towards lowliness, even towards the rich. And when you're looked at, therefore, as rich by yourself or by others, remember who you really are. Remember what your actual status is. Sometimes I try and run my sermon by my kids, which is usually a move of desperation, and was this week. And you kind of go, how would I say this to them? And it's really interesting. So they're like, what is humiliation? Like, okay, that's too many syllables. Because they're 8 and 6. And the little ones don't care and don't listen. They try and say humiliation. It's cute, but they don't know what they're talking about. And in that, one of the things I tried to get, so I was like, okay, how do I say this to them? And I went, you know what? Here's the lesson. Don't forget where you will be forever. And don't ever let yourself think that where you are right now is where you'll be forever. And that's essentially what James is trying to say. And that's what we need to walk out of here with. If you want to see reality, if you want to see living faith manifest itself, let it show you where you'll be forever. And don't you mistake where you are now for where you will be forever, in either direction. Jeremiah 9, thus says the Lord, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast in his might. Let not the rich man boast in his riches. But let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who practices steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, declares the Lord. The gospel is that God has given you steadfast love in a way you couldn't hope for. Boast in that and enjoy delighting in him and him delighting in you. Okay, let's pray.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.